When I was 10, our school teacher read us a child's biography of Mozart. And you know, I lived in a very rural community. Most of my playmates were, you know, farm children, or you know, they didn't know anything about classical music. But I heard the story of Mozart's childhood, and the idea of a little boy who could write symphonies just thrilled me. So I went home and got a piece of paper and a straight edge, and I drew the 5 lines of the staff and the treble clef, and then I realized I didn't know how to compose. And I was so disappointed because I really thought I could write a symphony. So I told my parents how frustrated I was, and they found me a teacher. So I started learning harmony and began composing. And I do think that's unusual, but actually, you know, 30 years later when I had my own children, I noticed how all children really do want to be creative. You know, they want to write books or make a movie or compose songs. And the problem is that the adults don't understand that. The adults don't encourage it, but I was lucky because my parents did.
You are a very famous and successful composer. Is there anything or anyone helping you to stay on the ground?
To stay on the ground, you mean to keep me from taking myself too seriously? Oh, sure. I think my son, he is also a composer, and he always puts me in my place. You know, I might get a wonderful review in the New York Times or, you know, some magazine or something, and then my son will hear the piece and tell me what's wrong with it. So and my wife is very, she's not so critical, but she makes sure that I do the dishes and take the trash out and, you know, sweep the floor. So I think that's really important because a creative work really is a very humbling experience. You know, when I start a new piece, even though I've been composing for 40 years, I feel like a child. You know, I can't believe how bad I am when I start a new piece. And we have to say, it's a wonderful expression, Zen beginner. You know, it comes from Zen Buddhism. And it's just this very important remembrance that every time you start something new, you're a beginner. And so you have to be humble, and you can't take yourself too seriously.
In which way does your career influence your private life?
Well, you know, I don't think of what I do as a career. I think of a career as being a lawyer or a business person. But my music for me is my life. And being creative is like breathing. It's like, you know, loving someone, or hating someone, or hating yourself. It's just a very, very continuous and complex activity. So I can't separate what you might call a career from what I do.
Nowadays, younger generations barely listen to orchestral music. Do you think that this type of music is about to die?
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that younger people barely listen to classical music. Especially come here to Vienna, where classical music is so important. But of course, you're right, and I noticed that the audience for classical music has gotten smaller, but there still is an audience, and I think that there's still interesting and meaningful things for a composer like me to say. And I don't have the big audience that Wagner had, for example, or that Stravinsky had, but I have an audience that's big enough. And people come up to me on the street and they tell me how much my music means to them, and that's really all I need.
When you create a new piece, is it good from the beginning or do you keep changing parts until you are pleased with it?
I start at the beginning. Some composers make sketches and then they kind of put the piece together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. But I can't do that. I have to begin it at beginning, first bar, and then I know where I'm going. Fortunately, I work with a computer, and I can make a version on the computer that's crude, but at least I can listen to it back and get a feel of the structure and the form. And that really helps me. In the old days, composers played things through on the piano, but I never played the piano. My instrument was the clarinet. We didn't have a piano in my home. So I'm very grateful for the computer because I'm good at it. And I can use it. And sometimes I get some of my musical ideas from what happens with the software.
How many compositions do you create until you have one that is perfect?
I'm afraid that I've never written a perfect piece. This morning I was rehearsing the Fourth Symphony of Beethoven with the Wiener Symphoniker, and this is a perfect piece. Although not everything Beethoven wrote was perfect, but it's very, very difficult to achieve perfection. I have some pieces that satisfy me, my own pieces. Sometimes I write a piece and it seems perfect or seems really good in my studio, and then I take it out into the world and hear it sung or played, and I realize it's wrong. It's too long, or it's too loud, or the pieces don't fit well. And that's really difficult because to take a big piece like a symphony or an opera, to have to take it apart and put it back together again, it just takes hundreds and hundreds of hours because composing is a very, very labor-intensive activity. And I can't have an assistant, I have to do it all myself. So we try to get it right the first time, but it doesn't always happen.
Do you travel due to a job?
Traveling is always a mixed blessing. And I think that every artist has to travel. 50, 70 years ago, I think traveling was much more difficult. If you read about, for example, George Gershwin, who wrote the Rhapsody in Blue, he did these tours where they got on a bus or a train and they were gone for like 2 or 3 months. And it would be terrible for me because I love being at home, and I love working, and I'm not very good at composing in a hotel room. And I almost would prefer to stay home, but everybody has to bring their work and themselves out into the world. For me, it's very difficult to, if I'm home for a month and then I know I have to go to Vienna, and particularly if I have to stand in front of an orchestra that I don't know, and they don't know who I am, it's always very stressful. I guess it's like a first date. You just don't know what's going to happen. And I have strange dreams before I leave, and I wish that I hadn't agreed to do it. But then when I get there and I realize this is an opportunity for people to meet me and for them to experience my music, and not through a recording, but with me conducting it, then I realize it's an important thing and we all have to do it.
Do you just listen to classical music or as well to R&B, pop and rock?
It's impossible not to listen to all kinds of music. If you go into a store to buy pants, you go to, there's music playing, and there's music playing in a restaurant, or, even just walking down the street, you hear music, you hear it on the radio. If you go to a movie.
You define yourself as a minimalist who got bored of minimalism. Why did you get bored of it?
That is an expression I never said. Somebody else said that. They imagined that, but I think that minimalism is one of the most important musical styles of the 20th century. And for me, minimalism is basically 3 things. One is the music is tonal. It's not like Schoenberg or Webern or Stockhausen, which is very dissonant. It's definitely in a key with a harmonic center. The second thing about it is it has a regular pulse. And so we say you can tap your foot to it, you know, and it's wonderful to dance to, and it has a feeling of forward motion. And the third thing about minimalism is that it tends to be created through the repetition of little rhythmic fragments. And in what we call the classical minimalism, like early pieces by Steve Reich and Philip Glass, you know, the elements are very precisely repeated and change according to very precise patterns. I'm 10, 12 years younger than Reich and Glass, and I loved minimalism when I first discovered it. I was probably 26, 27 years old. And up until then, I was writing not 12-tone music, but rather confused music. I was influenced by John Cage and maybe a little by Pierre Boulez, but I didn't really like that music. And then I heard minimalism, and I was thrilled. But the problem that I had with minimalism was that it was very rigid, very rigorous, and I'm a very dramatic person. So I tried from the start to use minimalism, but to turn it to a much more dramatic and less rigid musical expression.
You're using historical or present events as a source of your inspiration. Why are you doing this?
I think that in the case of opera, if opera has any relevance at all, it needs to speak about our contemporary life. And unfortunately, when you go to the Staatsoper or to the Metropolitan Opera in New York, most people go to hear an opera about, you know, life 100 or 200 years ago, and it's entertaining, but it's not really relevant. Although stage directors, you know, they'll do, I don't know, Don Giovanni and set it in an office building or something and try to make it appear to be modern. But for me, it's just wrong. What you should do is a new opera. And so my themes have been largely about things that are very important in contemporary life. I wrote an opera called Nixon in China, which is not only about Richard Nixon and Chairman Mao, but it's also about communism and capitalism, which are the two political systems of the 20th century. And then I wrote an opera about terrorism, the death of Klinghoffer. I wrote one about the atomic bomb, which is one of the most important moral challenges of our time. And I think that the success of my operas has been because people relate to those themes. So when I write a piece of music, I want that piece to represent not just me, but what it was like to be alive in 2015.
A short ride on a fast machine was planned twice for last night of the proms, and both times it was cancelled. How was that for you?
Short Ride in a Fast Machine is probably my most popular piece, probably because it's short. It's only 4 minutes long, and it was inspired by a ride I took in a sports car by a driver who drove very, very fast. And it gets performed a great deal. The Proms, which is a very famous summer concert series in London, scheduled it twice, and they had to cancel it. The first time was because of the death of Princess Diana, and she had died in an automobile accident just a few days before, and I think the BBC felt that having a piece about a short ride in a fast car was in bad taste, and I think maybe they were right. Then the second time it was performed, was supposed to be performed 2 days before was September 11th, and the attack in New York. And again, the Proms felt that this piece that was very kind of high energy was probably not correct, and they changed the programming. And again, I think they were probably right, but eventually they performed it the next year.
How do you work when you write a piece for orchestra? How do you begin? Can you explain your working process on the example of City Noir?
People ask me how I write, and I wish I knew, because if I did, I'd probably write twice as much music. But each time I start, I really don't know what I'm doing. I don't have a method. I think maybe that's a good thing, because if I had a method, I'd probably produce the same kind of piece. Just like some painters, they have a successful canvas and it sells for a lot of money, so they keep doing the same thing over and over again. But for me, each piece is different and each piece is new, and I don't know how to start it. So sometimes I start just with a rhythm. Sometimes I start with a chord sequence, and then I put the rhythm to it later. I very rarely start with melody. If I have a melody, it's usually based on a harmonic progression. And I always need something to play on. I either bang on the piano, which I'm not very good at, and I don't want anybody to hear me, or sometimes I use a synthesizer.
Which composers are your role models?
I'm very often asked, who my favorite composers are, and I can't answer that question. It would be like asking somebody, which is your favorite child? I have periods when I get obsessed with a composer. I might be in a Stravinsky period, or Bach, or Mahler, or Miles Davis, or Duke Ellington, or I might be listening to music we don't know who the composer was, from the Middle Ages or from Africa or something. I don't have any role models, really. Each person is unique, and there's something to learn. I learn a great deal from reading about Mahler, because he was a conductor and a composer, which is something I do. But I'm also very inspired by jazz musicians, because they have such great musical knowledge, but they internalize their musicianship and make it spontaneous, and that's something that means a great deal to me.